Blake Carter knew something was wrong with the house before the front door even opened. The work order itself already sounded strange. Broken lock. Possible frame damage. Resident requested same-day repair. But when he pulled his old pickup truck into the quiet suburban street, just before sunset, he noticed details that told a bigger story. One ceramic flower pot had been knocked sideways near the porch steps, dirt scattered across the wood boards, and the frame around the front door had a fresh crack near the deadbolt, like someone had slammed into it hard enough to shake the whole entrance. Blake grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and walked up the porch slowly. He knocked once, firm but not loud. A few seconds passed before the door opened barely 3 inches. One cautious, I looked through the gap first. Sharp blue-gray eyes. Tired eyes. Can I help you? Blake Carter, he said calmly, holding up the repair form. Neighborhood maintenance contractor. Someone called about the lock. The man behind the door studied him carefully before finally opening it a little wider. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing an oversized gray hoodie and black sweatpants like he had thrown on the first thing he found. He looked exhausted but not weak. More like someone who had spent too long carrying stress alone. I'm Martin, he said. Sorry, I just don't open the door fully anymore unless I know who's outside. Blake nodded once. Smart habit. That answer seemed to surprise Martin slightly. Most people laughed off caution. Blake didn't. When Blake stepped inside, he immediately noticed the quiet feeling of the house. Not empty, just tense. Like people inside it had gotten used to listening for bad things. The living room was small but clean, with folded blankets on the couch and framed family photos lining the shelves. A soft lamp glowed near the hallway. Somewhere deeper in the house, an old television played quietly. Then an older woman appeared from the kitchen carrying a mug with both hands. Her silver hair was tied back loosely, and she blinked at Blake with open curiosity. Oh, she said warmly. You're finally here. Martin sighed softly. Mom, he's here to fix the lock. Still counts as finally, she answered. Blake smiled politely. Nice to meet you. This is my mother, Eleanor, Martin explained quietly. She lives with me. Eleanor pointed toward the kitchen. Do repairmen drink coffee, or is that against the rules? That depends, Blake said. Is it good coffee? That earned the first real smile he saw from Martin. While Eleanor shuffled back toward the kitchen, happily muttering about cinnamon creamer, Blake crouched near the damaged door frame and examined the crack. The wood had splintered inward near the strike plate, and the old screws barely reached deep enough into the frame to hold anything properly. Someone hit this hard, Blake said. Martin crossed his arms. Yeah. Blake glanced up. You want to tell me who? For a second, Martin looked like he might brush it off. Then he leaned against the wall and rubbed a tired hand over his face. My ex, he admitted quietly. He showed up last week after drinking too much and didn't like hearing I wanted him out of my life for good. Blake looked back at the damaged wood. Cops. They came after he left. And now? Martin shrugged once. Now I replace locks, apparently. Blake understood more than Martin probably realized. He grew up watching his mother check door locks 3 times every night after his father disappeared. Some people stopped feeling safe long before they admitted it out loud. He pulled out his tools and started removing the broken strike plate carefully. The frame's weak, he explained, even before the damage. Cheap screws. Cheap wood. Somebody puts enough weight into this, it gives. Martin watched him work quietly. Can you fix it? Yeah, Blake answered. Properly. That word seemed to settle something inside the room. Eleanor returned carrying coffee mugs and set one beside Blake carefully. Martin used to fix everything himself, she said casually. Then he started working too much. Mom, Martin warned gently. What? It's true. Blake took a sip of coffee and nearly blinked in surprise. This is actually really good. Told you, Eleanor said proudly before disappearing again toward the living room. Martin looked embarrassed. Sorry about her. Don't be, Blake replied while measuring the frame. She reminds me of my mom. The conversation slowed after that, but not awkwardly. Blake focused on cutting out the damaged section of wood while Martin leaned against the kitchen counter watching him. Outside, evening light faded slowly across the quiet street, and porch lights began turning on one by one through the neighborhood windows. "You do this full time?" Martin asked eventually. "Repair work mostly," Blake answered. "Woodworking on the side when I get enough orders." "What kind of woodworking?" "Furniture. Cabinets. Shelves. Stuff people want built solid instead of cheap." Martin nodded slowly. "Must be nice knowing how to make things last." Blake slid a hardwood reinforcement piece deep into the frame and secured it tightly before answering. "Most things last longer when somebody actually takes the time to build them right." The room went quiet again after that. Not uncomfortable, heavy in a different way. Martin looked toward the door for a few seconds before speaking again. "You always talk like locks are life lessons." Blake smirked faintly. "Occupational hazard." For the first time, Martin laughed softly. It wasn't loud, but it changed his whole face. Blake noticed that immediately. By the time he finished reinforcing the frame with longer screws and solid oak backing, the lock clicked smoothly into place with a firm, heavy sound. Blake stood and tested it twice with his shoulder. The frame barely moved. "There," he said. "Now if somebody tries kicking this in, they'll hurt themselves before they hurt the door." Martin stepped closer and tested the lock himself. The deadbolt slid cleanly into place. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. "It feels different," he admitted quietly. "Safer," Blake corrected. Martin looked at him after that in a way that felt strangely personal. Eleanor suddenly reappeared holding a plate of cookies. "You staying for dinner?" she asked Blake hopefully. Martin looked horrified immediately. "Mom." "What?" "The man fixed our door. We can feed him." Blake tried not to laugh. "It's okay," he said. "I should get going anyway." Eleanor frowned dramatically. "That means no." Martin rubbed his forehead tiredly. "She gets stubborn after 7. "I heard that," Eleanor called while walking away again. Blake packed his tools slowly, but he noticed Martin still standing nearby instead of walking him out immediately. Like maybe he wanted the conversation to keep going, but didn't know how. Finally, Martin spoke quietly. "Can I ask you something weird?" "Depends how weird." Martin hesitated long enough that Blake looked up fully. Then he asked, "Would a man like you ever date somebody with this much baggage?" The question landed harder than Blake expected. Martin looked away almost immediately after asking it, embarrassed now that the words were out. "Sorry. Forget I said that." But Blake didn't answer right away. He studied Martin instead. The exhaustion in his posture. The way he still kept glancing toward the front windows whenever headlights passed outside. The way he apologized for things that didn't need apologies. "A man like me?" Blake repeated finally. Martin gave a small, awkward shrug. "You seem stable." "You know what I mean." Blake leaned one shoulder against the wall. "Depends." Martin looked back up carefully. "On what?" "On whether the person's worth staying for." Silence filled the room after that. Real silence. Not awkward. Not empty. Just honest. Martin's expression changed slightly, like nobody had answered him that directly before. Before either man could say anything else, Eleanor's voice floated in again from the living room. "Martin." The porch light came on by itself again. Martin sighed instantly. "Motion sensor. We talked about this." But Blake noticed something important. The moment the porch light switched on outside, Martin instinctively looked toward the door again. Fear had become muscle memory. Blake grabbed one of his business cards from his toolbox and placed it on the kitchen counter. "If the lock gives you trouble again, call me." Martin picked up the card slowly. "You answer late?" "I don't sleep much," Blake admitted. Martin gave a tired half-smile. "That makes 2 of us." Blake headed toward the front door, but before he stepped outside, Martin spoke again quietly behind him. "Thanks," he said. "Not just for the repair." Blake looked back once. Everybody deserves to feel safe in their own house. Then he walked down the porch steps into the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet now. Warm porch lights glowing across peaceful suburban homes. Wind moving softly through the trees. Normal. Safe. But halfway to his truck, Blake glanced back toward Martin's house one more time. Martin was still standing behind the door, watching him leave. And for some reason Blake couldn't explain yet, that stayed in his head long after he drove away. At 2:13 that morning, his phone buzzed beside the bed. One text message. From Martin. "He's outside again." Blake was already pulling on his boots before Martin's second text arrived. He's banging on the door. The message was enough to erase the last traces of sleep from his body. He grabbed his hoodie from the chair, shoved his phone into his pocket, and headed outside without bothering to fully wake up first. The neighborhood was silent except for the distant sound of rainwater dripping from gutters. Most houses were dark. Martin's wasn't. The porch light was on. Blake crossed the street fast and immediately heard the shouting before he even reached the driveway. Martin opened the damn door. A fist slammed against the wood hard enough to echo through the quiet street. Blake walked up the porch steps steadily, not rushing, because rushing made people sloppy. The man standing outside the door was taller than Blake expected, broad shoulders under a dark hoodie, baseball cap pulled low. He smelled like beer, even from several feet away. The guy raised his fist again. "That's enough," Blake said calmly. The man spun around immediately. "Who the hell are you?" "Guy who fixed the door," Blake answered. The ex stared at him for a second, then laughed once without humor. "You kidding me?" "She." He stopped himself and corrected quickly. Martin called the repair guy for backup. Blake ignored the jab. "You need to leave." The man stepped closer instead. "This is between me and him." Inside the house, Blake heard movement. Then Eleanor's frightened voice somewhere deeper inside. "Martin." That alone tightened something inside Blake's chest. The ex heard it too and pointed angrily toward the door. "That's my family in there." Blake kept his voice even. Funny way to treat family. The man's jaw flexed. "You don't know anything. I know you're pounding on somebody's front door at 2 in the morning." For a second, it looked like the guy might shove him. Blake stayed still, shoulders relaxed, weight balanced. He had worked construction jobs long enough to recognize the exact moment anger became dangerous. Behind the door, Martin finally spoke. His voice sounded controlled but tight. "Ryan, leave." The man immediately turned back toward the house. "No, we're talking about this now. You're drunk." "I'm angry. Same thing with you lately." Ryan slammed his palm against the door again. The reinforced frame held solid without even rattling much. Blake noticed that too. So did Ryan. His eyes narrowed. "You really reinforced this thing?" "Yeah," Blake answered. Ryan scoffed. "Congratulations. You want a medal?" "No," Blake said. "I want you off this porch." Ryan stepped closer until they were nearly chest to chest. "Or what?" Blake calmly pulled out his phone and pressed record without breaking eye contact. That seemed to change the mood instantly. Ryan noticed. "You serious right now?" "Very." Ryan laughed again, louder this time, but there was less confidence in it now. "Martin," he called toward the door. "You hiding behind strangers now?" The lock clicked softly from inside, but the door stayed shut. Then Martin spoke again. "Blake, you don't have to do this." Blake kept his eyes on Ryan. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "I kinda do." Ryan shook his head slowly like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You screwing him already?" Blake's expression didn't change. "You need to leave." Ryan stared at him another long second before finally stepping backward off the porch. Not defeated, just calculating. "You think this fixes anything?" He snapped toward the door. "You think one new lock changes what we had?" Martin didn't answer. That silence seemed to hurt Ryan more than yelling would have. He pointed once toward the house. "You'll call me eventually." Then he turned and walked down the driveway into the rain. Blake stayed where he was until he heard the car engine start and disappear down the street. Only then did he lower his phone. A few seconds later, the deadbolt unlocked slowly behind him. When the door opened, Martin looked worse than before. Pale, exhausted. His hands were shaking slightly, even though he kept them shoved into his hoodie pockets. "You okay?" Blake asked quietly. Martin let out a breath like he had been holding it for 10 minutes. "Yeah," he lied immediately. From deeper inside the house, Eleanor appeared again, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "Did he leave?" "Yeah," Blake answered gently. "He's gone." She nodded but still looked nervous. Martin rubbed his face tiredly. "I'm sorry you had to come out here." Blake frowned slightly. "You texted because you needed help." "I know, but that's not something you apologize for." Martin looked at him for a second after that, then finally stepped aside from the doorway. "Come in before the neighbors think we're filming a crime documentary." Blake almost smiled at that. Inside, the house felt warmer than outside, but the tension still hung in the air. Eleanor sat carefully on the couch while Martin locked the door again behind Blake, checking the deadbolt twice without realizing he was doing it. Blake noticed. Martin noticed Blake noticing. Embarrassment flashed briefly across his face. "Sorry," he muttered. "For what?" Martin looked toward the lock. "I didn't used to be like this." Blake leaned one shoulder against the wall quietly. "Yeah," he said. "You did." Martin blinked once. "What?" "You just didn't have a reason to notice before." That hit harder than Blake intended. He saw it immediately in Martin's face. Eleanor suddenly pointed toward the kitchen. "There's leftover pie." Martin groaned softly. "Mom, it's 2:30 in the morning. And trauma burns calories," Eleanor replied firmly. For the first time all night, Blake laughed. A real laugh. Martin stared at him for a second, like the sound surprised him. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in the kitchen eating pie straight from mismatched plates while rain tapped softly against the windows. The tension had eased slightly, but not completely. Martin still jumped every time headlights passed outside. Blake pretended not to notice. "What exactly happened between you two?" he asked carefully after a while. Martin stayed quiet long enough that Blake thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he sighed. "Nothing dramatic at first," he admitted. "That's the worst part. Ryan was charming for years. Funny. Protective. Everybody loved him. And then..." Martin stared down at his fork. "Then little things started becoming my fault. Then bigger things. Then suddenly I was apologizing every day just to keep the peace." Blake listened without interrupting. "He never hit me," Martin continued quietly. "But sometimes I almost wished he would have, because bruises are easier to explain than..." He stopped himself there. Blake understood anyway. Fear that lived in your body long enough eventually became routine. "You got out," Blake said finally. "Barely." Neither man spoke after that for a while. Eventually, Eleanor drifted back toward bed, mumbling good night to both of them. When she disappeared down the hallway, the silence between Blake and Martin changed again. Softer now. More personal. "You can take the couch," Martin said quietly. "It's late." Blake hesitated. "You sure?" Martin gave a tired half-smile. "Honestly, I don't really want to be alone tonight." That answer settled something deep inside Blake before he could explain why. Around 4 in the morning, after Martin finally disappeared into his bedroom, Blake stretched out on the couch fully dressed, one hand still loosely holding his phone. Upstairs floorboards creaked once. Then silence. And sometime before sleep finally pulled him under, Blake realized something dangerous. He already cared way too much about this house. For 3 days after the night at the hospital, Martin barely answered Blake's texts. Not completely ignored. Just enough distance to feel wrong. The first day, Martin replied 6 hours late with, "Busy shift. Sorry." The second day, Mom's appointment ran long. By the third day, Blake stopped pretending he didn't notice the pattern. He stood alone in his garage workshop, sanding the edge of a wooden shelf while Martin's silence sat in the back of his head like a splinter. Normally work helped him think less. This time it didn't. Because the worst part was that nothing bad had actually happened between them. If anything, things had gotten too real too fast. Blake remembered the way Martin looked at him in the kitchen at 3 in the morning after Ryan left. Like he felt safe and terrified at the same time. That look stayed with him. A truck door slammed outside the garage. A second later, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, holding a paper bag against her chest. Blake blinked in surprise. "You drove here?" "No," she said proudly. "I manipulated a neighbor into bringing me." That almost made him laugh. She walked into the workshop slowly, studying the half-finished furniture around her. "You really do live inside a lumberyard. Occupational hazard." She set the paper bag on his workbench. Martin baked too many muffins. Blake stared at the bag. Martin bakes when stressed. That explained a lot, actually. Eleanor watched him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "You think he's avoiding you?" Blake leaned against the table. "Feels that way." "He's scared," she corrected. "Of me?" "No," Eleanor said softly. "Of needing you." That landed directly in Blake's chest. Eleanor walked slowly around the workshop, fingers brushing lightly across shelves and unfinished wood pieces. Martin's father left when he was young. Ryan stayed physically, but emotionally he made Martin feel abandoned every single day anyway. After enough years of that, people start preparing for loss before anything good can even happen. Blake stayed quiet. Then Eleanor added gently, "Martin only runs when something starts mattering too much." After she left, Blake stared at his phone for almost 10 full minutes before finally typing one message. "You okay?" Martin replied 20 minutes later. "Yeah, nothing else." That one word irritated Blake more than silence somehow, because it sounded fake. That night rain rolled through the neighborhood again, soft against rooftops and windows. Blake tried focusing on work orders, invoices, literally anything else, but around 10:30 his phone rang unexpectedly. "Martin." Blake answered immediately. "Hey." For a second all he heard was breathing. Then Martin spoke quietly. "Can you come here?" Something in his voice made Blake grab his keys before the call even ended. The hospital laundry department sat in the basement level under harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look exhausted. Blake followed the sound of industrial machines until he found the open doorway near the back hall. Martin sat alone on top of a stainless steel folding table beside rolling carts full of white sheets and towels. The giant dryers hummed steadily around him. He looked drained, not physically tired this time, emotionally hollow. Blake walked in slowly. "What happened?" Martin rubbed both hands over his face. Ryan came by again. Blake's expression hardened instantly. "At the house." "No, here." Martin laughed weakly without humor. Apparently humiliating me at home wasn't enough. Blake stepped closer. "What did he do?" "Nothing dramatic," Martin muttered. "That's his favorite kind of damage. Just stood outside my break room talking about how nobody's ever going to stay with somebody this broken." Blake's jaw tightened. Martin looked away immediately after saying it out loud. For a few seconds, only the sound of machinery filled the room. Then Blake asked quietly, "And you believed him?" Martin let out a tired breath. "I don't know." That answer hurt more than Blake expected. Martin looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work anymore. His shoulders were tight. His eyes were shadowed from too many sleepless nights. Blake realized suddenly that Martin probably spent years surviving instead of actually living. "You disappeared for 3 days," Blake said finally. Martin closed his eyes briefly. "I know. You gonna tell me why?" Martin laughed softly again, but this time there was frustration in it. "Because every time my phone went off, I hoped it was you." Blake said nothing. Martin looked down at his hands, and that scared the hell out of me. There it was. Finally honest. "I spent so long learning how not to need anybody," Martin continued quietly. "Then suddenly you show up fixing doors and drinking coffee with my mother and sleeping on my couch like it's nothing. And now my entire nervous system relaxes every time I hear your truck outside the house." Blake felt his chest tighten slowly. Martin swallowed hard before continuing. "I don't know how to do this without feeling terrified you'll leave too." The honesty in his voice hit harder than anything else could have. Not dramatic, not poetic, just painfully real. Blake stepped closer until he stood directly between Martin's knees where he sat on the folding table. "You know what my problem is?" Blake asked quietly. Martin looked up at him. "I fix things instead of talking about them." Blake shook his head once. "The other night, after Ryan left, you tried opening up to me, and I started cleaning tools like an idiot because I didn't know what to say." Martin stared at him silently. Blake continued, voice calmer now. "I'm not good at this either." "Yeah," Martin whispered. "But you still came." That sentence settled deep inside Blake. Because Martin was right. No matter how uncomfortable emotions made him, he still showed up. Every time, Blake lifted one hand slowly and rested it lightly against the side of Martin's neck. Warm skin, tense muscles immediately softening under his touch. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," Blake said quietly. "You don't have to trust forever tonight, either." Martin's breathing slowed slightly. Blake looked directly at him. "Just let me stay long enough to prove I mean it." Something in Martin's expression cracked then. Not dramatically, just enough. His fingers closed suddenly around the front of Blake's hoodie, like he needed something solid to hold on to. Then very quietly he admitted, "I think I'm already in too deep." Blake's heart hit hard against his ribs. Neither man moved for a second after that. The dryers hummed around them. Warm air drifted through the room, carrying the scent of detergent and clean linen. Somewhere upstairs, an intercom announcement echoed faintly through the hospital halls. But inside that laundry room, everything suddenly felt still. Martin looked terrified. Blake understood why. Because he felt it too. Slowly, Blake brushed his thumb once beneath Martin's jaw. "Hey," he said softly. Martin looked at him. And that was the exact moment Martin leaned forward first. The kiss wasn't rushed or messy or desperate. It felt like both of them had been holding tension inside their bodies for weeks and finally let it go at the same time. Martin's grip tightened slightly on Blake's hoodie as Blake kissed him back carefully, one hand still resting against his neck. Warm, slow, certain, not lust, relief. The kind that sneaks up on people after surviving too long alone. When they finally pulled apart, neither moved far. Martin rested his forehead briefly against Blake's shoulder and laughed shakily under his breath. "Well," he muttered, "that definitely made things more complicated." Blake smiled for the first time all week. Little bit. Martin looked up at him again, softer now, less guarded. Then quietly, almost nervously, he asked, "Would you come over tomorrow night?" Blake brushed his thumb once along Martin's jaw again. "Thought I already did that." Martin rolled his eyes faintly. "I mean officially. Officially how?" Martin hesitated only a second before answering. "Dinner. With me and Eleanor." He swallowed once. "Not as the repair guy. Not as my emergency contact person. Just because I want you there." Blake looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'd like that." And for the first time in years, Martin smiled without looking afraid immediately afterward. Dinner with Martin and Eleanor was supposed to feel awkward after the kiss. At least that was what Blake expected. Instead, it felt strangely natural. When he knocked on the front door the next evening, Martin opened it almost immediately like he had been waiting nearby. He looked different tonight. Less exhausted. Still wearing a dark sweater and jeans. Still carrying shadows under his eyes from too many years of night shifts, but lighter somehow. And Blake noticed something else immediately. Martin smiled the second he saw him. Not nervous. Not guarded. Just happy. "You're early," Martin said. "You said dinner at 6. It's 5:52. Blake shrugged. "I respect punctuality." Martin laughed softly and stepped aside so he could come in. The house smelled like garlic, butter, and fresh bread. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table folding napkins very seriously, like she had been assigned an important military operation. The second she saw Blake, her entire face brightened. "Oh good," she announced. "You kept him." Martin nearly choked. "Mom." "What?" Men worth keeping usually disappear. Blake tried not to smile too hard at that while Martin covered his face briefly in embarrassment. Dinner itself was simple. Pasta, salad, cheap wine. But somewhere between Eleanor telling old stories about Martin as a teenager and Martin threatening to hide every family photo in the house, something shifted quietly inside Blake. It felt domestic. Dangerously domestic. The kind of normal life he had spent years pretending he didn't want because wanting things made losing them hurt worse. After dinner, Eleanor drifted toward bed early, leaving Blake and Martin alone in the kitchen with half-empty wine glasses and soft music playing from somebody's old radio. Martin leaned back against the counter watching Blake rinse dishes. "You know," he said quietly, "most people would have run by now." Blake glanced over his shoulder. "From your mother or your cooking?" "My emotional baggage." Blake turned the faucet off. "You really think that's all I see when I look at you?" Martin didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. Blake dried his hands slowly before walking closer. "I see somebody who spent years surviving things that should have broken him," he said quietly. "That's different." Martin looked down at the floor for a second, like he didn't fully know what to do with kindness yet. That became the rhythm of things after that. Not dramatic romance. Not fireworks every second. Just Blake slowly becoming part of the house. Some nights he stayed for dinner. Other nights, he fixed random things Martin never got around to repairing himself. A loose cabinet hinge. Broken porch light wiring. The uneven kitchen shelf Eleanor hated. Martin started sleeping better. That was the first thing Blake noticed. The dark circles under his eyes softened little by little. He laughed easier now, too. Sometimes Blake would catch him humming quietly while making coffee in the mornings, like his body was slowly forgetting what constant fear felt like. Then one afternoon, everything tilted again. Blake was inside his garage workshop, sanding a dining table when his phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, he ignored those. This time he answered. Blake Carter. Yeah. Hi. This is Daniel from Hawthorne Custom Interiors. We reviewed your portfolio submission from last year. Blake froze slightly. Last year. Before Martin. Before any of this. We'd like to offer you a full-time master carpenter position in Chicago if you're still interested. For a second, Blake said nothing. Because Chicago meant better money, bigger workshop, real career opportunities. Everything he used to want. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. But afterward, Blake sat alone in silence, staring at unfinished wood pieces scattered across his workshop. And for the first time since getting the offer, he realized something uncomfortable. His first thought hadn't been excitement. It had been, what about Martin? 3 days later, Martin found a printed offer letter by accident sitting beneath a stack of invoices on Blake's workbench. Blake saw the exact second his expression changed. You got offered a job in Chicago? Blake wiped sawdust from his hand slowly. I was going to tell you. Martin nodded once. Calm. Too calm. That's amazing. It's not official. But you want it. Blake opened his mouth. Then stopped. Because months ago the answer would have been immediate. Yes. Now it wasn't. Martin gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. You should take it. Martin. No, seriously. Martin folded the paper carefully. You worked hard for this. Blake stepped closer. You're upset. I'm trying not to be selfish. That's not what I asked. Martin looked away toward the open garage door, where evening rain had started falling softly outside. You know what the problem is? He said quietly. I actually started believing maybe you'd stay. That hit hard. Blake stepped forward immediately. Hey, but Martin backed away first. Not angry. Worse. Resigned. Don't, he muttered softly. Don't make promises because you feel guilty. Then he left before Blake could answer. That night, Martin barely texted him back. The next night wasn't much better. And suddenly Blake understood exactly how Martin had felt during those days after the hospital. Distance hurt. By the fourth night, Blake finally drove to Martin's house in the middle of a thunderstorm because he was done pretending space would fix this. He found Martin standing alone near the front door, checking the deadbolt before bed. Again and again, like muscle memory. Martin noticed Blake behind him and immediately straightened. You didn't text. I figured this worked better in person. Rain tapped softly against the porch outside while silence stretched between them. Finally, Blake spoke. You know what's messed up? Martin crossed his arms. Probably several things. Blake ignored that. For years, I wanted out of this neighborhood so bad I could barely stand it. Every house here reminded me of struggling. Broken heaters. Leaky roofs. People barely getting by. Martin stayed quiet. Blake stepped closer slowly. Then somehow your house became the only place I actually wanted to come back to. Martin looked at him finally after that. Real emotion cracked through the calm expression he'd been hiding behind for days. Blake continued quietly. You think I'm staying because I feel responsible for you, don't you? No, Blake shook his head once. I'm staying because somewhere between fixing your front door and drinking cinnamon coffee with your mother, you became home to me. Martin's eyes looked dangerously bright now. Blake moved closer until only inches separated them. I'm not saying no to Chicago because I'm trapped, he said softly. I'm saying no because there's finally something here worth staying for. Martin looked down hard for a second, like he was trying not to completely fall apart emotionally right there. Then very quietly he admitted, I don't know how to trust this. Blake nodded immediately. I know. I keep waiting for it to disappear. I know that too. Martin laughed shakily. wiping once at his eyes in frustration. "This is embarrassing." "No," Blake said gently. "This is what healing looks like." That finally broke whatever wall Martin still had left. He covered his face briefly, shoulders shaking once as the first real tears Blake had ever seen from him finally appeared. Blake stepped forward immediately and pulled him close without hesitation. Martin held onto him hard. Not elegant, not cinematic, real. After a long moment, Blake reached past him and rested one hand against the reinforced front door. "You know the lock works now, right?" he asked quietly. Martin let out a weak laugh against his shoulder. "Yeah." Blake brushed his thumb gently against the back of Martin's neck, then stopped, waiting for somebody to break in. Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt peaceful. Months later, Blake officially opened his own woodworking studio 2 streets over instead of leaving town. Martin transferred to day shifts at the hospital. Eleanor's memory still drifted sometimes, but she smiled more now, especially whenever she caught Blake and Martin unconsciously moving around each other like they had lived together for years. One rainy evening near the end of summer, Blake found Martin asleep on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket with a book fallen open against his chest. The porch lights glowed warm against the dark street. Blake smiled softly and draped his jacket over him carefully. Martin blinked awake slowly. "What time is it?" "Late." Martin caught Blake's hand before he could pull away completely. Inside the house, Eleanor watched through the kitchen window and shook her head fondly. "Took you boys long enough?" she muttered. Blake laughed quietly. Martin smiled sleepily up at him. And outside, rain tapped softly against the strong front door of the little house that no longer felt afraid anymore. And maybe that's what love really is. Not grand speeches or perfect people, but someone who keeps showing up even after seeing the cracks in your door and the damage behind it. Someone who stays long enough to help you believe you are safe again. Blake and Martin didn't find a perfect life. They found something better, a home built slowly, honestly, and together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet love and second chances.